Thank you, Carol, and welcome to old and new friends alike. Today's Tiny Syringe, we are inviting Mel as a return guest. In episode 1 with Mel, we talked about the incredible social pressures that young ladies are dealing with in today's society as they're expected to have a hot take on virtually every meaningful thing that's going on the planet. This conversation started with a dialogue about the controversy in Minneapolis and the possibility of defunding the Minneapolis Police Department. And now we have extended the conversation into this question that we're going to tackle in this episode, which is, how does a young 20-something woman in the world today, how does that person focus on the things that are unique to them, that special place that they have in the planet, and those few honest things that they can kind of headlock and wrestle to the ground and make uniquely their own. So Mel, have you given that any thought? And are there any exercises or things that you do to try to explore, those special Mel places on the planet?
Yeah, absolutely. After our first conversation, I had a lot to think about, and the word that always pops up in my head, probably because of how I was raised, but is the word purpose. And it's kind of a triggering word because there's so much to unpack there.
Love that word.
But I do too. I think it's so important. And I do believe that everybody has purpose. And I think everybody has specific gifts to themselves, which is something that you mentioned. And being aware of those gifts, figuring out those gifts, because you might not have had somebody call out your gifts specifically to you, but you know them as a person. And I think it's important to figure out what your gifts are, figure out what makes you want to get out of bed in the morning. And I think that's so important.
And Mel, doesn't that tie back into our first conversation? Because here's another single word back at you, and it's the word distraction. And I just can't think of a worse enemy to a person's purpose than the distraction of having to have the next hot take on Twitter. Agree or disagree?
Absolutely. Yes, it is, especially with social media being absolutely distracting, seeing what everybody else is doing. And I think it's so important to make sure that you're focusing on what's in front of you, what you have right now.
Right.
And how, because doors will always open if you're taking steps in the right direction. And also just do what you love and what you're naturally talented at. And I think
I see a couple of words coming together. One is intention, and then let's bring your word back, which is purpose. When you marry those two things together, here's what I think will happen. It'll unfold, and it won't be this week, it won't be this year, it'll unfold over decades, Mel. But if you are in that space and you choose to invest yourself right there, and I'll go back to that idea that maybe 3, maybe on the outside, 4 things that you are uniquely gifted to do, that is your purpose, the thumbprint that Mel needs to put on the planet. I think what you move towards is what I would term the spark of the divine. That there's that ember on the inside of Mel. And gosh, it seems like you have the choice between either being distracted by the 1,000 or selecting the 1 and saying, man, today, what can I do with this ember, this spark of the divine inside of me? And I think if you'll contemplate that and take that seriously, I think one of the things that will occur from that is you'll see a Mel a decade from now. You'll see Mel in your 40s and 50s. You'll see an older Mel, maybe a grandma Mel. And what'll happen is the decades in front of you will become clearer and clearer because you just focus and focus and focus and focus and focus. I want to drill down into that word focus a little bit, but let me get your comments first.
Yes. And I am the most easily distracted person that I know. So this is so good for me. I heard, I think it was TD Jakes, he said this, and it really stuck with me. But you can have all the intention in the world to do the things that you feel are your purpose or your calling or that you're gifted at. But there's just such a huge difference in intention and then actually taking the initiative
Yeah.
to do those things and
Yeah.
focus on those things.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of my first step after this conversation with you is not only figuring out those things, but taking steps to do them.
Well, let me help you with the figuring out. So what method or strategy do you do when it's just Mel talking to Mel and you're trying to figure those things out?
Oh, dang. I honestly, besides prayer and just having those conversations with myself of things that I were drawn to when I was younger and things that I know that I am they're easier for me than the average person, and every person has that. So whether it be communicating with people or forming quick relationships and friendships,
right?
There's just a couple things and things that I'm passionate about that I am having to have that conversation.
Yeah. Well, you know what? We've got two great jumping off points. Okay, you just brought up the word relationships. That's the first time that's come up. We need to drill into that. We need to talk specifically about how critical it is to be decisive about your relationships, short-term and long-term. And the other thing that we're going to drill into a little bit here is I'm a big fan of the ancients. I am sad that your generation, unless you're in these very, very different pockets of America, you never hear from the original philosophers. You never hear the great books of antiquity. And I want to take a few minutes in our next podcast to talk about the words of Aristotle and talk about how he thought human beings were very unique in our capacity. So let's talk about relationships and let's talk Aristotle in our next episode. So that is our tiny syringe for today. I welcome your feedback, and here is how you can reach us. Thanks.